Christians are, of course, as deeply implicated in this as anyone. The Hebrew scriptures are full of matter-of-fact references to enslavement, to regulations governing both slaves and their masters, and Christianity was formed in the Roman Empire, one of the most slave-based societies ever seen. The early Christians responded to that context with a typically spiritualizing, non-confrontational approach. They insisted on the spiritual equality of all believers and taught that in Christ the distinction between slave and free vanishes, and they therefore argued that physical slavery was of lesser importance, that Christian slaves ought humbly to submit to the masters whom God has providentially given them, and masters should treat their slaves as their brothers in Christ, which might or might not entail setting them free. In medieval Europe, though, economic changes, and this does seem to be an economically driven process, mean that Christian slaveholding morphed into serfdom, and after the plagues of the 14th century, even serfdom eased or disappeared. But in the 15th century, an entirely new form of Christian slavery appeared. Portuguese navigators exploring Western Africa began to enslave the peoples they encountered. And then the Spanish and Portuguese empires established in the Americas were from the beginning intended to run on slave labor. And since the indigenous population was nearly wiped out by disease and imperial brutality, that meant importing Africans. Those first empires were, of course, Catholic ones. Protestants came late to the Atlantic imperial race and had definite moral qualms about slavery from the beginning. There's several pious early rejections of slavery. Most early Protestant imperial projects deliberately set out to staff their colonies with freely employed indigenous laborers, whatever that might mean, or with European immigrants. But the economic realities of the New World were already set and were not easily defied. When the Dutch or the British conquered Spanish or Portuguese colonies, they took over the slave economies that they found functioning in them and kept them supplied by importing their own slaves. When they tried to use European colonial labor, they found that their colonists kept tediously insisting on tolerable working conditions, and even then they died in the tropics at a prodigious rate. All the while, the Spanish and Portuguese slave trade meant that African slaves were readily available for purchase throughout the Caribbean. How could they resist the opportunity? On every Protestant-held Caribbean island, slavery began as marginal and quickly became dominant. Or take the North American colony of Georgia, founded in the 1730s, and initially intended by its founders to be free of slavery. The attempt only lasted months. The colonists reported back to London that a white man in these lands, if he cannot buy a slave, must work himself like a slave. To be blunt, it is very hard to compete with unpaid laborers who can be worked literally to death. And once you're importing slaves for yourself, then you may as well sell to others as well. By 1700, English ships were taking a dominant place in the transatlantic slave trade, without ever quite actively deciding to do so. The Protestant powers had immersed themselves in African blood.